Hi, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. I'm here with Alex Tabarrok. Alex, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Great. And you're a professor at George Mason University. Do you have any other affiliations?
Lots of them, I guess. I'm a senior fellow or something of that nature at Mercatus. Yeah, so there's a bunch of them going different places. Advisor to a bunch of startups, that kind of thing.
Okay, great. And so you were involved in Operation Warp Speed. Is that right?
Sort of. So what happened was early on in the pandemic, I was asked to give a talk to the Council of Economic Advisors and the Domestic Policy Council of the Trump White House. And they asked me to talk about using incentives to speed up the delivery of vaccines. And this is before Operation Warp Speed. And I get on the call, and it turns out that they have invited me and Michael Kremer, who is the Nobel Prize winning economist, number one world's expert on this question. Um, anyway, I was very forthright and, just saying, look, the economy is losing, tens of billions every week, hundreds of billions a month. We need to do something. We need to accelerate vaccines. This is going to be something which is going to pay off really well. I talked about human challenge trials and, was really going into it. Turned out Michael Kremer was in complete agreement, even on the radical stuff like human challenge trials, which is very fortunate. It gave me some credibility because he has the Nobel Prize. And after the call, the White House, the people at Domestic Policy Council, asked us to write a report. And Michael got a bunch of other economists together, and we did that. And we proposed something much like what became Operation Warp Speed. I don't know what influence we had. All the top people were on the call, so maybe we had some influence, or maybe we just reassured people that they were going in the right direction.
So you said you and Kramer agreed on these things. All the economists I see, I'm not reading a representative sample of economists. We're basically in accord with, vaccines are important and do this quickly in human challenge trials and all that. Well, you think a consensus view in the field or a near consensus, or how would you characterize? Is it just a George Mason thing, or do you think most economists were on the same page here?
I think it was pretty surprising, actually, that at least many of the economists who were speaking publicly about this, were became radicalized as the pandemic got longer and longer and longer. They became more radicalized. Not just the economists, but I've been a longtime critic of the FDA. Pointing out that there's an invisible graveyard, right, which is when the FDA delays a good drug, then people die who would have lived, but they're buried in this invisible graveyard. It's hard to see. And it was amazing to me that the pandemic brought this home to a lot of people. And so you started to see articles in like the New York Times, Ezra Klein, and people like that became very anti FDA, or at least arguing that the FDA needs to speed up. So that was kind of remarkable to see that change over time. And I think economists were in the same boat.
Yeah. And what they did was, something that people didn't think they could do. They could get the vaccines that quickly. People were surprised. Do you think the lesson from all of this was that we could have done, like, okay, let's say cancer was a new disease and it was killing, I don't know how many people cancer kills a year, hundreds of thousands, millions. I have no clue, right? But if the cancer was just like a new thing and we said, oh my God, we can't put up with this. We're going to have to do a Manhattan Project to get rid of cancer. I mean, is this something we could do much faster, but there's just no sense of urgency? Do you think that there are broad lessons here that we could apply to other areas of medicine and science?
I think there are narrow lessons, and people are probably taking it too broad. So I'm a huge supporter, obviously, of Operation Warp Speed. I think it was the government program which has had the highest benefit to cost ratio of anything since, let's say the Manhattan Project. Just a tremendous, tremendous success. And now people are talking about, well, we need an Operation Warp Speed for X, for Y, for Z, for cancer. And I don't think it works out so easily because there were a few very special factors. Number one was that we'd actually done a lot of research prior. So, the genetic code of the virus was uploaded to the web something like January 11th. By January 13th, a vaccine had already been designed by a bishop and people at the NIH working with people at Moderna. So it only took a couple of days to design the vaccine. What really took the time, right, was doing the clinical trials. And the clinical trials were the most expensive part of drug development. And the government came in and supported that. Also, the government said, Operation Warp Speed said, look, start building the factories that you need to manufacture these vaccines. Start building them now. Ordinarily, the vaccine manufacturer, they're going to wait until the vaccine has been approved and, it's working and it's approved. Now we'll start building the factory. And then a little while later, a year later, maybe we'll have it ready to go. And so Operation Warp Speed said, start building now. Maybe it's going to turn out that your vaccine doesn't work. That's okay. We're willing to take on that risk. But we want the factory to be ready the moment a vaccine is approved. Now, those two things, paying for the clinical trial and accelerating the building of the factories, that's all off the shelf stuff. There's no big research and development. It's a technology problem. It's not a science problem. So the science, I don't see, we already support the science a lot with university funding and, there's lots of money for cancer research. And, I'm not saying we shouldn't support it more, but you can't accelerate the science the same way you can accelerate the technology, the same way you can accelerate just the business decisions to start building the factory now rather than later. So I think the areas where an Operation Warp Speed could be successful are fairly limited. They may be important. Like, we just, NASA just sent up a spaceship to bang into the asteroid and knock it off course. And if we had to do that in real time, yeah, we could build, get the rocket ships and, the SpaceX and, recommission some. So we can solve technology problems, business problems, speed those up, not so much science problems.
So yeah, so vaccines were a proven technology, and you said they developed that vaccine. They developed the first vaccine right away. But something like was the first vaccine they developed over the weekend? That was one of the mRNA vaccines.
Correct.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
they had this technology. So the mRNA technology was, I guess, somebody knew that it could work. And they were ready to do it right away, but the mRNA had not been used before, right?
It had not been used in a successful vaccine before. So, at least on a commercial scale. So Moderna had been investing millions and millions of dollars, and so had BioNTech. They'd been, BioNTech, hired, Karolika, this researcher who couldn't get money from the government. She went to Pfizer, BioNTech. Anyway, so Operation Warp Speed is also a big success for the venture capitalists because they had been funding Moderna and BioNTech without any profits for like 10 years. They're just spending all of this money developing this technology. There's no products, but they had produced small runs of drugs and vaccines. So they knew the technology could work. It was just, they hadn't had the opportunity to scale it at a commercial level.
Yeah. So okay. So there was this technology that you needed the government support. You needed cutting red tape. You needed to buy the purchase orders. I guess what I'm wondering is maybe there is and I have no idea if this is true or not. But is it possible that there could be some technology out there for cancer that if we did this, if we gave the same treatment, if we said we're going to help you with the trials, we're going to help you with the liability issues,
Right.
we're going to help you buy even buying purchase orders and things like that. Is it at least plausible? And we went to the biggest biotech companies and said, we're going to trust you. Just give us your best idea. We'll do the purchase orders. We'll do the speeding up the trials. Everything. Is it possible we could get some kind of similar result, or you think no? It's just the vaccine thing is unique.
Yeah, I think the vaccine thing is fairly unique. Another way of thinking about it is, look, you're really just accelerating progress. So let's even take a long time scale, like 10 years. So in 10 years, do we expect to have a cure for cancer? No, right? I mean, I expect things are getting better, right? And, there's a little bit of progress every year, and I would rather have the treatments of 2032 than the treatments of 2022. But even if we brought the treatments of 2032 and brought them, to 2022, it wouldn't be quite the miracle that the vaccines were. We'd all be very happy about that, but, it wouldn't be the miracle a change. Where I think something like Operation Warp Speed might work is just, I've just thrown this out as an example, but um, protecting the electrical grid from like from a solar storm, right? So that's again one of these events which happens sort of once every 100 years, and but a bad solar storm could literally, wipe out the internet, wipe out computers. This happened in the Victorian era. It wiped out the telegraph, the first telegraph. And you could just imagine like how bad that would be. I mean, you've seen in Texas, the electrical grid goes down, and it's incredibly expensive. But we could protect ourselves from that by burying the lines, insulating the lines. We have that technology, but the electrical companies are not willing to spend all that money, to update all of their equipment. But that's something that a Operation, Warp Speed program could probably do.
So how did the Trump administration find you in the first place?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'd written a little something for Mercatus on using prizes and things like that. So I think maybe somebody said Michael Creamer, and somebody else said, "Well, we need some conservative guy." And so I don't know how they found me, but something along those lines.
Yeah, and so and what month was this when you had that call and
So it's a good question. So it was pretty early on. It would have been like March or April, something like that. I can't quite remember. The
okay.
other thing which people don't know or don't remember accurately is actually the Council of Economic Advisors had written a report in 2019 talking about the potential $1 trillion loss of a pandemic. So that was purely coincidental, but they were in kind of a good place to be thinking about these issues. And the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, Thomas Phillipson, he was a University of Chicago guy, and so he'd written about FDA delay, so he knew my work. So maybe it was through him or something like that. But he again was in a good spot to, coincidentally, but was in a good spot to give Trump good advice.
So yeah, so you put stuff on the internet and somehow somebody found you. I guess that's how it usually works.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah. Is so you so this was so your views were radical outside the mainstream for economists. I mean, I used to talk about columnists like Ezra Klein, people people even people on the left, people on the right. These were popular ideas I saw just in the circles that the people I follow online. This wasn't the consensus view, or even seems like a majority view in the public health community, right? And so public health, my understanding is they were much more cautious. What do I have ideas here, but what do you sort of attribute that difference to?
Yeah, so I think they weren't popular views at the beginning. They became more popular over time. um, but yeah, the public health people. I mean, there was a New York Times piece early on looking at all of the things we could possibly do to accelerate a vaccine. Okay. And it sort of gave you a options, so you could be the vaccine czar and do this and do this. And even under the most optimistic scenarios, we wouldn't have gotten a vaccine. So, until much later. Um, so I think there was a feeling that this just wasn't possible to accelerate it that much. They underestimated, what could be done. In fact, we talked, the team was Michael Kramer and all these economists, myself. We started talking very early on with a bunch of people in the field. And we said, what would it take to get a vaccine approved in under a year? How much would it cost? He said, oh, that's impossible. It can't be done. And then you'd sort of say, well, what if we gave you $1 billion? And then they begin to like think about it, and just nobody had ever offered this kind of money to them before. Nobody had, they hadn't really thought about it. So when you came with that kind of money, and in the grand scheme of things, what Operation Warp Speed spent, like 15, 18 billion, was not a huge amount. Certainly not a huge amount relative to the benefit. But people in the medical sphere had never thought about, well, what could we do if we had $1 billion? Well, we could start doing this and this and this. And once you got them thinking about it, then it became clear that maybe something could happen.
Yeah, and I mean the thing about the pessimism, I guess what's a little bit confusing is about it because okay, you had the mRNA technology, nobody knew for sure how great that would be, but you also had vaccines developed on traditional vaccine technology, right? I mean, and the Chinese
Yeah.
had a vaccine, and the Russians had a vaccine, and they were not as good, but they could have they could have contributed to a return to normalcy. I think they protect pretty well against extreme outcomes. So, why didn't anyone, like, people couldn't foresee mRNA? Why couldn't people foresee that you could have like a Sinovac or something like that pretty quickly?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and uh, I actually think we should have made it. The one thing that Operation Warp Speed did, which I was a little bit worried about, is we made all of these high tech bets, and we did not make a bet on a low tech, traditional vaccine. And so we were arguing that we ought to make a deal with China that we'll give you some mRNA if it works, and you give us some traditional stuff if yours works, and we'll make the swap. Of course, with Trump, that kind of deal with China wasn't likely to happen. But why people weren't more optimistic, yeah, I don't know, because you're absolutely right. The Chinese also did a great job. And I think the Chinese vaccines, as you say, they're pretty good. They're better. I think they're better than people think because there's a little bit of propaganda on both sides, right? About how well these vaccines work.
Yeah, although the Chinese, interestingly, have not vaccinated their elderly yet, so it works. But the public choice failures are not simply an American problem. It seems to
This,
be.
this
Yeah,
is yeah, the insanity of what the Chinese have done. I mean, it's very peculiar to me that they can literally nail people inside of their apartments, but they're not willing to, greatly encourage people, elderly people, to get a vaccine, which is going to save their lives. It's very, very bizarre the costs that they've willingly undertaken.
yeah. Although it does sort of remind me of the American response. I mean, we are more willing to do lockdowns or masking for everyone than we are mandatory. Mandatory vaccines seem to cause a lot more pushback.
Yes.
So maybe there's some we're just like them after all. I mean, maybe there's they're a little bit more able to lock people down, but it seems like nobody wants to nobody wants to force people to take vaccines against their will. Although it's strange why they don't go you know more my opinion of the China has just come down to they're yeah one of the things you said in your I watched one of your talks that you got worried about COVID early because you saw an authoritarian government shut down early, and you look at their revealed preferences and you thought, well, they must care about economic growth much more than they care about saving lives. And I look at that
Yeah.
now and I see their what they've done to their economic growth, and I think maybe our
Yeah.
entire model of what motivates this regime was completely off.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, I got that wrong. Yeah, I did think that if anything, the Chinese were more concerned about GDP than human rights, and oddly, that seems
Yeah.
not to have been the case.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it could be human rights. It could be saving people. It could be just power and
Right.
control. I mean, there's
Yeah.
something going on here, and it's not a simple story of economic growth. Um, so this is a. Did they ever consult with you after you did that report? Did they ever call you or ask for anything after that?
Yeah. So we revised the report a number of times, and we were in contact with them as well as with the British government, and later we became advisors to the World Bank and a bunch of different governments, around the world. So I was kind of called in to speak with people in Colombia and Guatemala and all over the world. So that was quite an exciting time.
Yeah. And how close do you think they came to doing human challenge trials? Is it, do you just feel like, I mean, I read Paul Mango's book on Operation Warp Speed, and I saw the part where he talked about it. It doesn't really provide much of a satisfying explanation, like, oh, people might, people had ethical concerns, so therefore we didn't do it. Do you think that there was ever, didn't the British, the British, I thought, were at least closer to doing, or didn't they even do it like
Yes.
later on in the pandemic?
Yeah, the British eventually did. And yeah, again, that was another bizarre thing. I mean, I think there was a huge amount of status quo bias, right? Or omission commission fallacy, right? So the way I explain it is this: even when parents are thinking about should I get my child, vaccinated, let's say pre-COVID, and one of the things that parents I think about implicitly in their head is that if I choose to have my child vaccinated and something bad happens, rare side effect, it'll be my fault. I will have taken an action which caused them to get sick, and I'm going to feel guilty. I'm going to feel terrible. I will have done something to harm them. Well, if I don't get the child vaccinated and the child gets sick, well, that's nature. That's bad luck. That's ill fortune. It wasn't something which I did. And I think people opposed a lot of so-called medical ethicists and bioethicists opposed human challenge trials because they felt, well, if we do this and someone gets sick, it'll have been my fault. We will have done that. And to both of these ways of thinking, my response has been, look, it's not about you. Okay. You have to take your feelings, your emotions out of the equation. It's not about whether you're going to feel guilty or not. Just do the thing which increases expected value. Do the thing which is best for society as a whole or best for your child, and take your emotions and feelings out of it. And that was very, very hard, apparently, for non-economists or, you know, uh, uh, for normal people, let's say, to do. Though I think a lot of the things which I criticize the government for acting too slowly with COVID, they are doing on the whole much better with monkeypox. So I think there will be human challenge trials for monkeypox. They've put in requests to do that. A bunch of places went to first doses first, which I had argued for COVID to delay that second dose, get more doses widespread of first doses, get it to more people. We didn't do that in the United States. We did it in Canada. Britain did it. But a bunch of places in San Francisco have just said, well, we don't care what the CDC says. We're going to do first doses first for monkeypox. So I think we are all of the criticism and talk, while it may not have moved things on COVID as much as I wanted, that has generated more support for doing things for monkeypox.
Yeah. So this is, I mean, this is an optimistic story, right? Government, it's, I guess, I mean, depending on, how you look at it, government failed. And the next time, and this is what I recently talked to Tyler, and this is, his characterization of it. And, next time it got better. I mean, it's not like the Biden administration has a press conference as, the Trump administration was right and public health and, and some of the people we were listening to were wrong. But, the better argument and the more rational policy sort of did win in the end. Is that how you see it too?
Sort of. I think that's reasonable. It's sort of, it's not that rationality wins so much. I think it's almost muscle memory. So I have a paper looking at uh, just prior to the pandemic, the Johns Hopkins University and the Economists and a bunch of groups put out this global health security index. Okay, and it ranked every country in the world based upon who was most prepared for a pandemic. Okay, and of course, it turns out the United States is number one, which, in retrospect, looks totally wrong. But it's a serious index. Anyway, what my colleague and I do is we look at this index and we say, is there anything in this pandemic preparation index which actually predicted which countries were prepared? And the answer is basically no, except if you, within the previous 3 years, had a other virus scare, like the avian flu, like H1N1, then you were a little bit faster. So it's kind of that muscle memory idea. A lot of the Asian countries, had a more serious avian flu, so they were more prepared in that sense, and that's what mattered.
Yeah. How many countries had an avian flu scare?
Well, most of them. I mean, most of them. It was pretty widespread. Um, but the United States got lucky that by the time it got here, we were able to, contact trace and tamp it down so quickly that it
Yeah.
didn't spread.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm skeptical that I think there's a confounding variable here because I live around a lot of Asians in Los Angeles County, and my goodness, they take COVID seriously. I mean, they are
Right.
masking more than any other people. You can see, and you look at they had an outdoor mask mandate in Korea until a few months ago. I mean, and they
Yes.
still they
Yes.
still have indoor. So yeah, it's it's sort of, to me, it's like it's not that mysterious. Like, if we want, if the rest of us behave like that, maybe things could be different. So it seems to me that, like, there's a cultural thing here that nobody's going to be able to easily capture in the data that mattered a lot.
Yeah. Now, as far as we can, now that could well be true. We did look at some cultural variables, like people do say, "Oh, the United States, individualistic culture, we weren't willing to sacrifice for the collective good." None of that predicts anything. Okay, so you look at sort of world values surveys, and you try,
What
maybe
if
they
what
weren't
if you
as
what if you then look at surveys and you looked at, say, if you wanted a proxy, I would be I'd like a proxy for risk taking behavior, out of wedlock births. I have
right, right,
something like
right.
that, right? Or
Yeah, yeah,
crime,
yeah.
violent crime. East Asia would be at the bottom, and they would have been better. This is, I think there's something. I think there's something. For values survey, I just, I know a lot about polling, and it's just, there's especially even within a nation, it's there's a lot unreliable. You start talking cross national and translations and all that. Yeah, I don't know how strong that is for getting at these values, actually.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah. So great. I mean, do you have aspirations to do other other work for the government, to bring your ideas into into fruition?
Uh, I mean, a lot of I do like to do work which has some real world, connection, and so I'm always interested in promoting work, as well as doing it in your office. Get out there and talk about it and promote it, and try and see if you can have some impact in the world. Um, I don't particularly want to work for governments, but I suppose if they call me, I'll answer the phone.
Yeah. So okay. So just, to go to, like, just to move on to the next topic. I
Sure.
recently read your is it an article or a book? The Baumol effect, why the price is so damn high. What do you
Right.
call that? Somewhere in between.
It's a long article or a short book.
It's a long article or a
Yeah,
short. Okay.
it's a little monograph. Yeah.
Yeah,
Uh,
monograph. That's the word I'm looking for. So you start with this graph, and it's like showing the things where prices have gotten more expensive, and things where the things that were the things have gotten more affordable. And I sort of always looked at that, and I've said, this is just a graph of government involvement in something. And this is sort of a libertarian story. You have healthcare and education, right? You have car repair, which is not okay.
right.
That doesn't really fit.
E-
But then
exactly.
at the bottom, you have home appliances, clothing, and generally telecommunications. Generally things that government is not involved in. But your idea is that it's having to do with the expense of high skilled labor. So or labor it's labor in general, isn't it? So can you talk about sort of what the theory is and how it differs from the
Sure.
conventional libertarian account?
Sure. So one way of thinking about it is, I always say when you go to a poor country, you should get your hair cut. Okay. Because you go to India, and I was in India. In fact, I had my hair cut in India
Were
a
you
few
with
months
were you
ago.
with Tyler? Tyler just got back from India.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Tyler and I were at a bunch of conferences together. Um, so why? Why should you get your haircut in India? Well, the price of labor is just so low that you can get your haircut, for less than $1 and get a really nice head massage, thrown in for that price. And the barbers in India are just as good as the barbers in the United States. I mean, it's not a super high skill activity. It's been done for hundreds of thousands of years, and they're good at it, right? So, and you think about, well, what are the things which are cheaper in less developed countries? And they're all these services, right? So restaurant meals tend to be cheaper, particularly if you buy your meals like a resident would, like a tourist. Um, uh, Massages, anything involved. It's why um, uh, when I was in India, again, I had like a driver, right? I cannot afford a driver in the United States, but in India, for one, I'm too afraid to drive on the roads. Nobody who does not live in India should ever drive there. But it's possible for somebody of middle class means to hire a driver, right? And this also, you see the same thing over time. So Agatha Christie kind of famously said, when I was young, I thought I would never be rich enough to afford an automobile, nor poor enough not to be able to afford, a cook and a servant, right? And over time, of course, the cook or the servants became much more expensive, and the automobiles became cheaper. So you see the same thing over time. What I'm saying is that you see the same relationships between poor countries and rich countries as you see between countries in the past when they were poor and countries today when they're rich. Namely, prices of goods have gotten low, while the prices of services, the richer the country is, the price of services are high. And probably the fundamental reason for this is that for a lot of services, not all, but for a lot, it's like really hard to increase the productivity. Okay, like, I mentioned barbers. The technology of giving somebody a haircut, that has not improved in like 1,000 years, right? Maybe the scissors have gotten a little bit sharper.
You have
Um,
the Clippers now, right?
you have the clippers now, right? Right. So that's a little bit better. The famous example from William Baumol, who first kind of promoted this stuff, is the a concert. So you have a 4-person concertina or whatever you call it, and 1820, okay, 4 people to do this particular piece takes them 40 minutes, okay, and in 2020 it takes exactly the same amount of time, but no increase in the productivity of that live, concert. But think about the alternatives for the musicians. Well, in 1820, those 4 musicians, they weren't productive in doing anything, right? I mean, there was no major manufacturing for them to alternative for them. Today, those 4 musicians, pretty high skills. There's lots of alternative employment with which is very, very productive. They're able to produce a lot. So the relative price of the service is going up over time. Like what you have to give up to get that 4 people to do a concert. Today, it's a lot more valuable, the stuff you're giving up, than it was in 1820.
Yeah. So the idea is, you're paying these people, doctors and teachers primarily, and they cost more because human labor costs more. I mean, what about those? What about those graphs that show like the growth? I mean, we have a lot more people involved, right? So we have in education, you have professors, but you have the administrators, right? And at some point, there became, at least in some universities, I don't know if at all universities, but administrators, passed up professors. A lot of them are doing, things like things, you talk about like the theory that this is all about, climbing walls and such, that's making the universities expensive. You're saying that that's probably not what's going on, but you do have armies of administrators that are enforcing everything from Title IX things to career services to counseling to basically all these things. And isn't that potentially having a big effect? Isn't that consistent with the skilled labor costs more, but we're hiring a lot more skilled labor for uncertain benefit?
Right, right. Yeah, so I wouldn't make the argument that um, we're not wasting a lot of money and resources. But actually, when you think about it, like think about auto manufacturing, which has become much cheaper over time. There's also a huge amount of resources wasted in that. There's similar kinds of regulations and safety regulations and more HR people and the list goes on and on about all of the rules and regulations, the cafe standards and environmental standards. And so it's not entirely obvious that services are subject to more government regulation or overaccumulation of administrators than is the production of goods. You and I see it because we're, involved in the education industry. But I think if we were in another industry, we would also have all these complaints about, all the bureaucracy which we have to do. So it's not obvious that that's explaining the relative difference. Maybe over time it's explaining some of the increase in costs, but why it affects these particular industries and also the same industries which are cheaper in developing countries, that again seems very peculiar, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I
And it's
mean, it
also
seems,
true, like to give you another example, like, you mentioned car repair. So car repair has become much more expensive relative to cars, which have gone down in price, quality adjusted. There's a bunch of examples like that. Tailoring. So again, when I go to India, I take some clothes and, they'll make you a suit, right? Overnight, which you cannot do here. So here we just buy new clothes. It's just too expensive. Or nobody today like takes their shoes, not nobody, but hardly anybody takes their shoes to a cobbler. What's a cobbler? Uh, and that's the reason for that is because it's just cheaper to buy new shoes than it is to repair the old ones because the old one repairing is a service activity, producing the new shoes is a manufacturing activity. We've just gotten much more productive at making shoes than repairing shoes or cars.
yeah. I mean, okay, yeah, that makes sense. Whether universities are regulated more or less than uh, car manufacturers. It's a good point, though. The reach of universities, like I've never seen, the reach of university regulations. I've never seen government try to enforce sort of a sexual harassment regulation directly, sort of micromanaging this stuff like they do at universities and have tribunals for students accused of sexual assault. So it does seem a bit more, it does seem a bit more intrusive, but the safety regulations and all
Maybe,
that
yeah. I
all.
mean, think about Tesla, right? Got sued, kind of a ridiculous case, not uncommon, because somebody said the N word to somebody else, and then that suddenly becomes not a personnel dispute to be resolved by Tesla, but $100 million legal dispute. It's kind of the same thing. And then Tesla, to avoid that, then they got to hire all of these people. I don't think it's that different.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. The one thing that is that sort of made me a little bit, I was taken aback a little bit in the pieces. You say, you often will say stuff like, "Oh, we've chosen to consume more, we've chosen to do X, we've chosen to do Y," and
Right.
as well as I do that the process through which we're choosing this is different from whether we're choosing to buy automobiles or buy houses or whatever. Especially in higher education, something of a market, although heavily subsidized.
Right.
Lower education, I mean, we have the primary schools and high schools and such. I mean, this is government. I mean, this is not a market.
Right.
And so, is it possible that what naturally would have happened is as these prices went up, if there wasn't this government involvement, if there wasn't these subsidies, we would just if our friend Brian Kaplan is right about education and really not doing anything, we would have become smarter and just decided to consume less of it and consume the other stuff instead.
Maybe, but so this is pointing to what I think is a flaw in the standard libertarian, if you want to call it that, but in the standard argument that uh, what explains the rising price of education and healthcare is all of this bad stuff, regulation, right? Because the natural response, if that were the case, the natural response is to do what you just suggested and buy less of this stuff, right? So you need some additional theory, which you hinted at, of why when the costs are going up, why when it is becoming so much more wasteful, are we yet doing more of it? So we have to explain on top of this, well, not only do we have rising costs, but we got bigger subsidies. Okay. Which like maybe it's true, but then you have to, you use this, you need then two theories and they have to be offsetting one another. in just such a way that we're still buying more. Well, in contrast, the Baumol explanation, right, is that we're getting richer. And so it's a very natural explanation that the same thing which explains the rising price, which is increased productivity, right? So the interesting thing about the Baumol explanation is that it's all about relative prices. And so the explanation for why the price of healthcare is going up is actually that the price of all the alternatives, like what you could do with your money, buy a car, buy computer technology, it's going down. These are two sides of the same coin. Really the same. It's really just one relative price. Okay. And so the Baumol theory is that the more productive we get at making manufactured goods, the higher the price of services. So at the same time that the so it's very easy to explain why you might buy more because with a rising price, because you're also getting richer. So it's the same theory which explains both parts. The rising price and buying more, one's a substitution effect, one's an income effect. Both are happening at the same time and have the same cause. So the Baumol theory is a much more clean theory in that you don't need these two separate things, you know, the climbing walls and subsidies happening at just the right place. And also the Baumol theory, sorry to go on, I'll stop. Look, this is people have been complaining about the increase in the price of healthcare and education for well over 100 years. So long before Medicaid and Medicare, you can go back to 1900 and people are saying it used to be so much cheaper, you know. Um, so these increases in prices have been happening for over 100 years. And they happen in all kinds of different countries with all kinds of different education systems, healthcare systems. There's even some evidence, which is kind of remarkable, that you saw the same thing in the Soviet Union. So, communist countries, no prices, everything's regulated. And yet they were becoming more productive in manufacturing at a faster rate than in services. And so they too were saying, hey, you know, we used to be able to go to the ballet, for much cheaper. Healthcare used to be much cheaper. So even in the Soviet Union, the Baumol effect appears to explain some of what was going on there.
Yeah. But it's still. I mean, that's still the. So yeah, I appreciate the sort of Occam's razor point. But assuming two things doesn't seem to me that much more complicated than assuming one thing. And it's still, I still sort of have the problem where you say we choose to consume, we choose to. It's the public education is just. It's a government budget. It's not a market. It's a completely different process. So like at the ballet, if people don't like the ballet, if it's not useful, they can just stop going. If they don't, if the public education is not doing anything for all that cost, yeah, it's they could defy the teachers unions and go vote for new elected officials who are going to spend the budget, the government budget on other things. But it's a much harder and much different process than just stop buying something, right? There's a more
Yeah.
potential here for government to just keep providing things that people they say they want but they wouldn't actually spend their own money on, than there is in a market.
I mean, I think that's sure there's some truth to that, but I think the public as a whole is pretty powerful over the long run. So I think, we have more doctors and nurses per capita over time. We have more teachers per student, over time. And I don't see any big push against that. I think that's probably what people want. People do go to the doctor more than they used to. People do want to spend more on education than they used to. So I think if the public were really um, so if it were just a matter of the public saying we're sick of this stuff,
Well,
uh,
they might not be. I mean, there's two different way. There's the difference between a human being, the same person making a market choice, and a person making a sort of democratic choice, right? So in the market choice,
sure, sure,
so
but over time, I think I'm a little skeptical of democracy. Okay, right? So I certainly you're not going to have to go far to convince me that democracy is imperfect as all are as are all systems, but I still think that on these big questions, like it's very easy to see on democracy how there are little tax loopholes which only benefit, one corporation, and there's a whole bunch of, tiny things in the law which just rent seekers would put them in. But on these big questions of how much we spend, on the military, how much we spend on healthcare, education, I think the public mostly gets what it wants.
So you think okay? So that's the yeah that's interesting. I mean, I think they get what they want, but what they want is sort of a it's a philosophical question. I think they get what they say they want, and if they had to actually make choices on their own, they would behave differently. They would shop around for the best school for their student. They would think about the choice more carefully. They would do so. Yeah, I think quote unquote they want they want you ask them in a poll, they'll say spend more money on education, spend more money on healthcare. This stuff is all social desirability bias.
Yeah.
Are we incentivizing them to make good and smart decisions even for themselves? That's the question.
Yeah, but like I mean, on education, already people have a huge incentive to think carefully about where to send their kids to school, and we know this is a big factor in real estate prices. So I don't think you know. So I don't think adding. Yeah, people would be more careful if they have to spend the dollar on the margin, but I don't think they're not unaware of this.
Is there
Same with
so
healthcare, right? Like with healthcare, yeah, you're usually not spending your money directly, but on the other hand, it is your health. So you do have pretty strong incentives, at least to choose quality, right? Maybe not to save money, but at least to choose quality. Um,
So the privates, how much does the typical private school tuition cost, and how much is it compared to what is it compared to a public school? Have you looked into that? Because this seems like it would be
yeah,
a natural way to differentiate between these
yeah.
theories.
So the private school is sort of divided. On average, private schools are actually cheaper, which people don't believe. But that's when you take into account like all the Catholic schools and all things like that. Um, so if you're not sending your kid to like the local Christian or Catholic school, uh, you're sending them to a private school, it's probably more expensive. Um, at least the price is higher. Uh, so there is that division, but overall, the private schools, and the charters are cheaper, though not hugely so.
Uh-huh.
And
Okay.
one thing about the private schools is a little bit different, but it actually because it bothers me a little bit is that you and I probably agree that education could be a lot better, and yet the private schools do almost the same things as the public schools. Like just my own little peeve, I would have thought that we should be teaching like memory palaces. Okay, how to teach children how to memorize big numbers, long lists, and all this stuff, and fast multiplication and division, and all these tricks. They don't do any of that. So it's not that different.
Yeah, I mean it's yeah. So I mean, when the near the end of the monograph, you talk about with productivity, productive potential productivity gains in education. So potentially, you can have one great professor who's there and he has thousands of students. The fact that I just when you talk about productivity gains in education, I just feel like I just feel that just that framing. It's like we're not producing if it's just signaling, right? Of course, you wouldn't expect that to work because the only reason Harvard is good is because not everyone can go to Harvard, right? And there's a status thing where you're on campus and you're participating in life. So if let's say let's say that uh, online education never really takes off, and in 10, 20 years things look exactly the same as they do now. Do you think that would be a strike against your theory, and the idea that we're even to talk about productivity and education is sort of missing something?
Um, yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, the thing about the Baumol effect overall is that it explains so many different sectors: education, healthcare, repair services, the arts, things of that. So it's very difficult to get, one theory which is going to explain all of these areas in as clean a way as the Baumol theory does. So whenever I debate this topic or talk about this topic, you know, experts in the education, oh, well, you're probably right about healthcare, but education, no, I see all these wasted, all these cost increases. And then if someone's an expert in healthcare, oh, you're probably right about education, but healthcare, right? So there's always going to be a plethora of industry specific explanations, but they don't have the, one ring, one theory to rule them all power of the Baumol theory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would say that, education, healthcare, there are reasons to think they're special. I mean, first of all, on that, graph you present, they are way ahead of, the price increase is double that car repair and whatever else. And then just sort of government spending, that we spend on these things.
Yeah.
You're just further away from sort of market assumption. So, yeah, you've convinced me, something is real there. But, people really do care about healthcare and education. And, it's probably worth figuring out what's special there and what we can do just because of the amount of resources that
Yeah,
we
for
pump
sure.
into it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, that definitely. I think we could do better. We could do better. I think we might, it might be possible to have like a level effect, but so long as we have increased productivity, you're still going to have a growth effect.
Yeah, you believe that we're doing something. You believe that there is a method of teaching. You said the private schools are not teaching as good as the public. You think that there's a method of teaching that there's sort of low hanging fruit that nobody is using. Can you talk about that a little bit? I remember seeing a blog post on this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So for decades, literally for decades, we've known that there's a method called direct instruction, which has been tested in serious randomized controlled trials against other methods. And it almost always comes out on top in literally hundreds of studies. So not like one or two or three, hundreds of studies in education have shown that this method, direct instruction, works better than other methods. And it actually makes sense in the sense that direct instruction uh, codifies for, you're going to teach reading, you're going to teach mathematics, division, multiplication. It codifies a method of doing that. It tests that method repeatedly until you have, ironed out all of the kinks, and then you write that method down. Okay. And then teachers follow the script, and they just follow the script. Okay. And the teachers, by and large, kind of hate this idea because they want to be free flowing and every student is different and, different methods, different ways of thinking. And no, that's all wrong. Okay. There is like one way of doing it. I'm exaggerating, but um, the method which really works is to figure out what's best and then mass manufacture, then have all the kids together. They work on it together and the teacher follows the script. And this method, although it looks, um, it doesn't meet the humanistic goals of the teachers. It meets the goals of the students in that the students move through the material more quickly. They learn the material. They're not bored because they're learning more quickly. They're keeping up. And despite the fact that direct instruction has been shown to be superior in hundreds of studies, it has not taken off the way it really
It's not
should.
about it's not about the, or it is, I mean, partly it's only partly about the standardization, right? Does direct instruction mean, okay, like if I'm going to teach economics, I just put the supply and demand, the graph up there, and I just keep beating in your head, and you just keep like staring at it? How does it like work sort of operationally? Is it just telling you things instead of you figuring it out for yourself?
No, not really. It involves a lot of uh, a call out to the class. Okay, you know, uh, what what comes after this letter, and then everybody shouts out. Okay, so it involves kind of almost like a military, call and repeat, and so there's a lot of structure to it. There's a lot of structure to it, um, but you can move through the material more quickly. So it's not, students don't think that it's boring.
Is this what people call like teaching to the test? Like there's just a right answer, and we're just going to tell you what it is, and we're not going to have any other frills or anything else.
So the direct instruction is most applicable, to uh, where there is a set of skills that you want people to learn. Okay. As opposed to when you get into higher ed and you want to try and teach people how to discover new knowledge, right? That's a sort of a different area where you need more one-on-one, kind of apprenticeship training, the way we have with graduate students, things like that. So it's not a way of getting rid of graduate school or apprenticeship training, but for the reading, writing, and arithmetic, it's phonics based, for example, right? So the trend up until very recently has been literally the teachers say, well, you don't know what this word is. Well, look at the picture. Yes. Okay. Which is a totally literally unprincipled method of teaching. Okay. Like, oh, there's a dog. Guess that this word is dog. While what you really want to do is, teach a phonics, and the phonics method is sound it out. Right.
Well, why
And
hasn't some
yeah,
just charter school or private school done this and then gone and shown their results to the state legislature or education researchers or whatever? And it's not
right.
exactly a free market, but it's something of a market. You think they could do
Yeah.
that?
So there's a few examples of that. There's the Tails Academy in North Carolina. They have done just exactly what you suggest. Um, yeah, why? You know, yeah, I don't know. I'm gonna start sounding like you. There's a conspiracy in the teachers unions. There's been some attempt to do it internationally. Schools have been doing it, but yeah, it just hasn't. And it's not that it's unknown. Um, but it hasn't taken over, that's for sure.
Is it? Is you said the teachers don't like it? Could the students not? Might the students not like it? I mean, that doesn't sound like the funnest classroom experience. Is it just some parents are reacting to what students want, and students just students want things other than just they don't even care if they're learning, but the parents want their kids to be happy in addition to them learning things, and maybe
Right,
this isn't conducive to human happiness.
right. As far as we can tell, the students are fine. The students enjoy it. It's the teachers who feel that they have been because you are following a script, so the teachers become actors, right? Instead of becoming, you know, entrepreneurs or artists, right? Where they're trying to come up with new ways, which is really silly when you think about it, right? Like there's some teacher in Nebraska who's going to come up with a new way of teaching reading, and that's going to be better than something which has been tested on hundreds of thousands of students and tried out in multiple different ways. Like, not only is that like really unlikely, um, it's sort of pointless in the sense that that teacher is going to teach, 30 students per year for 30 years, like 900 students, total in his career. Okay. So the gains there are so little, which is why the standardization is important because, then if everyone is following the script, everybody gets the benefit of the improvement in productivity. Right. So this does go back to what we we're talking about with services like, um, mass manufacturing, why does it get cheaper over time? Well, because when you make an improvement, and maybe it's just some like tiny improvement, you reduce the amount of material used by 1%. Okay. You lower the defect rate, by 1%. But you do that year after year after year. And then that builds up and you get mass improvements in productivity. But now, if you have a 1% improvement in teaching quality, how does that scale? Right? It can only scale if people are following a script. And if they're not willing to do that, if teachers are not willing to kind of follow a script, then you're not going to get this improvement in productivity over time.
Mhm. Does I mean, do is does it matter? I mean, in the long run, because there's learning loss. I mean, the people don't remember what they do in school. I mean, is it the most important thing in the world whether kids get things that they retain things better when they're first grade, second grade, third grade. This maybe in a relative sense it does because they can get better degrees and credentials, but does that necessarily make society more productive?
I mean, societies, which are better educated, have better outcomes on a wide range of metrics. So I think that's one thing which,
Well,
I,
direction. I mean,
I'm,
there's a big direction of cause. I mean, there's a big direction
of
of causation.
course, yeah, yes, of course. So, but that is one thing which I think makes, uh, I'm pretty much behind. Brian Kaplan, argues that a huge amount of the premium for education, as you know, is signaling. And I think that makes total sense, particularly at the university level. Like it's hard to understand why somebody who gets a degree in art history is paid more than somebody who went to, work in a factory for 4 years, even if they end up in the same job, right? It's got to be signaling. But it's not all the engineers are not signaling. They're not only signaling. I think Brian says like 50%, is his sort of, modal estimate of the amount. Well, 50% is not signaling. Let's improve that 50%, the productivity of that 50%. And I would say as you get down to, high school and even earlier, then like, 60, 70% is human capital building and only 30% is signaling. So let's improve that 60 to 70%.
Yeah, because you're getting what basic reading skills. You're getting basic arithmetic. People just being able to
Yeah,
that
and it's look, it's not natural to think logically. And it's just not natural, I mean, reading is not it's not a natural thing to do. There's no other animal which reads as far as I know. So reading is not natural, but it's incredibly important. Um, so yeah, I think mathematics is not natural. And it's kind of scary that the literacy rate even in the United States, when you measure at the adult, the literacy rate, people who can read a paragraph and explain in their own words what that paragraph means, it's a surprisingly low percentage.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, we, there's human limit. It's like people cannot bench 250 pounds. It's like we're smart people look at that and they it's like a bodybuilder looking at people and saying, look at these puny weaklings. Like it's really scary. They could all be they could
Yeah.
all be Arnold Schwarzenegger. And sometimes I think we might not have realistic explanations here, but expectations here. But no, I take
Yeah.
your point that we can hopefully have some improvements. So the related topic to this is the American criminal justice system. You say
Mm,
we're
mm.
under policed and over prisoned. So can you talk about that a little bit? What's the argument here?
Yeah, sure. So, um, this defunding the police, I think, is a crazy, crazy idea. Um, and some of my research has been on the effectiveness of police. And it's just kind of a hard question to study because uh, when you look at places where there's a lot of police, there's also a lot of crime, right? For sort of obvious selection reasons. Like people, in hospitals die a lot, right? So to untangle that causality, you got to kind of break the reverse causality from more crime to hiring more police. Um, and the way my colleague and I do it, we look at there's this terror alert level in Washington, D.C., which it's a national, but when there's some chatter that something's going on in the Middle East and there might be an attack, this terror alert level goes from like yellow to orange. And the police in cities like D.C., they put up double shifts, so you get more police on the street. So my colleague and I, John Click, measure what happens to crime in DC when you kind of randomly get a bit of chatter in the Middle East. You randomly get more police on the street, and crime goes way down. Okay, nothing else does. Nobody else cares about this thing. Nobody even knows when the terror alert level is high or low.
Do
But
they still
crime,
do this? Is the color code system? This was after 9/11. Do they still how long have they been doing this?
yeah, they've
When
been
did they
doing
stop?
it, yeah, since almost 9/11.
So they're still doing it.
Um,
The terror alert
yeah, as
might
far
still
as
go
I
up, and
know,
the
yeah,
PC will still
yeah.
send call out. Hmm.
Yeah, exactly. As far as I know, they're still doing it. And so using the estimates from our paper, as well as for many other papers in the literature, we suggest like it would be perfectly reasonable to double the number of police in the United States. And this sounds, crazy, except when you look at Europe, the United States actually underspends on police relative to a lot of other countries. We think that we're a tough on crime country, and we are when it comes to prisons and the length of prison sentences. But when it comes to police, we're actually kind of under policed. We're not a leading, we're not a mass, we're not a police. We don't have as many police on the street as do a lot of other developed countries. So my view is that if we could change what it means to be tough on crime from throwing them in jail and throwing away the key to making sure that people are caught, to raising the probability that people are caught. So we need like more police on the street, more homicide detectives, so that people get the message. If you commit a crime, you're going to be captured, you're going to be caught. Then we could have lower prison sentences and deterrence would actually be greater because that's what really people care about. That's what they notice, the probability of being caught much more than the severity of the punishment if they are caught.
Yeah, that makes sense. One thing, one of my, first reaction to this, and maybe this is contradicted by, what happens or what doesn't happen in DC, but I think that a lot of these neighborhoods, I don't know if the people themselves are hostile to police, but at least sort of the, activists and the, intellectuals who claim to speak for these communities are hostile to the police. And I think there's something about alliance with sort of the criminal element who, for obvious reasons, are also hostile to the police. So the, my first thought when you say, well, double the American police presence, you're going to send them to the high crime areas. Actually, I think that maybe there'll be riots. I mean, the first thing that pops in my head, but
Yeah.
it sounds like in DC they do add these police to the streets, and DC has African American high crime areas, and apparently it doesn't cause riots. Or did you look for? Was there any like backlash to this that we could see in the data?
Yeah, not in our study, but I agree. It's a very complicated situation. Like the way I sometimes put it is that we need better policing so that we can all be comfortable with more policing. The views of people, in the inner cities or the high crime African American areas are very conflicted. Um, because on average, if you ask, like they want more police. Okay. So they are not in favor of defunding the police. Okay. They typically want more police because they bear the brunt of crime. At the very same time, um, there are a lot of people who won't talk with the police, right? Who snitches get stitches and things like that. Um, because in some places, the criminal element has basically become the major source of violence and authority in the region. They've taken over from the state, right? And so you begin to follow the mores and the rules of these local criminal gangs rather than the rule of law of the country as a whole. So there's a bunch of stuff which is, the kind of a paradoxical circle in that crimes don't get solved in the inner city. So people don't bother speaking to the police, and they're also afraid to speak to the police because they know that the perpetrator is going to be back on the street, or their friends are going to be back on the street, or that somebody who is a witness and who speaks to the police, they are also going to be. So you get an equilibrium where people are afraid of speaking with the police because they could be killed, and people are killed because their witnesses are afraid of speaking with the police. So you kind of need like a big push to kind of get out of that equilibrium so that people become willing to speak to the police. And then when they're willing to speak to the police, then the threat of them being killed for speaking to the police goes away. So you
Yeah,
get to the
yeah,
good equilibrium.
yeah, I'm, yeah. I mean, that's sort of I don't know. I'm so pessimistic because you look at like you send more police. Like it seems like the things that cause like riots and breakdowns seem so stochastic. It's like you have one criminal who's been arrested 25 times, and like he's the one who the entire community, like I don't know if it's the entire community, but the people who want to go out and march in the streets, they're the one. He's the one who get upset about. So it's like the cops could save 50 lives. They kill one criminal, one lifetime
Yeah.
criminal, and the neighborhoods will burn down. It's just a very sort of tragic situation. It just seems like that would be great. So it seems like if you didn't have that sort of backlash effect, great police, more police would be a great option. It's just very very complicated. It seems like you're always one bad incident away from everything blowing up, and you could say have better policing, but it's never perfect, and it's like the social the dynamics here are like often it'll come out the entire story that the media was pushing and these activists pushing
Mm.
were completely false, and it like still doesn't matter. So even if the police are perfect, it seems like you still get these incidents, and I just think it's very
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I worry about most, and I know you've thought about, is just the general decline in trust in the United States as well as elsewhere. But in the United States, like trust in your fellow, man has declined. Trust in any authority has declined, and that has particularly bad consequences when it comes to policing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not totally, I don't think the trust is a one sided thing. I think some kind of skeptical of governance. You've talked about how the
Oh,
public health, communities have failed. I
sure.
remember, I read, was it, maybe it was Brian who wrote about, and he was in Italy, and the police were like, enforcing the mask mandates, like with, with gusto. And I don't know if
Yeah,
that's a
yeah,
trust thing or whatever, but like, it seems like a lot of the resistance to sort of the bad things American government does is
right.
based on this, lack of trust. So I think there's pluses. Yeah, not trusting, not trusting the police, especially when our
No,
police,
that's
I think are not that bad. Like I've been in countries where like you have to give bribes to police. It's like I think globally, I think we have very very good police, and I think distrust there, I think is particularly poisonous.
yeah, I think you're right. We have very good police. You and I probably do. People in some of the inner cities, maybe less so. Um, but also, there's this paradox which bothers me, which I would love it if people had less trust of government and sort of more trust of markets. But these things are very hard uh, to disentangle. So it seems more to be the case that either you have a generalized trust in your fellow man, or you don't. And so countries actually, which have a lot of trust, have less regulation because they figure, well, things, the corporations will do what they're supposed to do, and they'll be pretty good overall. And so, we don't need all of this oversight and bureaucracy and stuff like this. Well, when you have distrust, uh, you get distrust in markets and distrust in government, and you still end up with more government. So I think that's a problem. Disentangling these two things, people don't seem able to do that.
That's interesting. So yeah, you have these. I think you're thinking about the Scandinavian countries. You have high trust. You have, in a certain sense, maybe less regulation than the U.S., but they spend more
Yeah,
of the higher taxes and more of their GDP per capita or GDP on government. The GDP per capita is lower. I'm pretty sure in all these countries except Norway, which has oil, and especially
yeah.
if you like. Given their high human capital relative to us, it's pretty surprising. So I don't know. It seems like the maybe it's like market. The great thing about markets is like you don't have to trust them for them to work. You can if you just distrust government and don't want it to do stuff. The markets will emerge. Just because people buying and selling and wanting things, but yeah, it's interesting. Do you think the U.S. you compare it to Europe, is Europe the right comparison, because you can compare them based on like wealth level of development. But we
Mm.
really look, if you look at like murder rate, we look more like a Latin American country than we do a European country. Not the worst Latin American countries, but we look more like maybe a lower end Latin American country than a Northern European or even a Southern European country. Um, does it is our under is when you look at this policing and the prison populations, is it different depending on where you're comparing to?
Yeah, and again, it's complicated because we are. we're a high murder society, high homicide society, but on
Yeah.
other measures of crime, we're not a high crime society.
Well,
Like,
do you trust those other? I mean, I think murder is the one that we can measure. All the other ones are, if
yeah,
when you go to a high crime neighborhood in the U.S., it's not like, oh, this neighborhood has a lot of murder, but don't worry, you're not going to get caught. There usually tends to be a very high correlation between those things.
that's true. But at least as far as we can tell, um, auto theft is also pretty well reported because usually you get insurance. I mean, I don't know. It's, you're right that homicide is kind of the best reported, but at least as far as we can tell, the United States actually does pretty good on rape and robbery, and so it looks like guns are kind of what makes a big difference. Guns and you know murder rates, of course, are particularly high in African American communities. So these two things put together kind of give us a outlier on homicide. But on the other things, we're not. Yeah, we're not that high
Yeah.
crime society.
Yeah, I mean it's hard. I mean, I saw some data. Sweden is high on sexual side. I'm like, how does
Yeah,
Sweden? They're very liberal people. How
yeah,
do they define? I'm sure it's like
yeah.
college campuses where they say 70% of women have been raped or something.
Right,
It's, you
right.
look at the data and it's not very trustworthy. Uh, so,
Good point.
Alex, is there anything interesting or anything you're particularly excited about that you're working on now?
Let's see. I got a bunch of this pandemic stuff, which is still coming out. Let's see, bunch of stuff in India I'm doing. Yeah, I'm not sure. I trying to. I guess crypto. I guess it's one of my side interests. I advise a bunch of different firms, startups, and so I've kept a toe in that world, and that's always interesting because they come to you with different problems, and so I have a little bit of business interests and things like that. It's always fun.
Are you optimistic about the long term trajectory of crypto?
I'm optimistic enough to think that it's worth some of my time to make a bet on it. Um, and here, okay, here's what really worries me, and I'll think about it this way: if we get a central bank digital currency (CBDC), right, CBDC, um, this would be extremely useful and I think could wipe crypto out. So a central bank digital currency would have all of the benefits of lower transactions costs and easy to make um, easy to make decisions across countries and so forth and so forth. But a CBDC would mean that the government would be able to track every single exchange, every single economic transaction which occurs anywhere at any point in time. It would give them the eye of Sauron, onto everything which is going on in a way which we have never experienced before. So, and the only alternative to a central bank digital currency, I think, is a privatized crypto currency, something like Zcash, which maintains privacy. So I do think we are coming to kind of a split, and if we don't go for a privacy preserving digital currency, then we're almost certainly going to get a central bank driven one, which whatever promises they give us in the beginning, the temptations to use that for control of the economy and private life are going to be so large that I'm very, very concerned about that.
Let me ask you this question. So, I mean, you have the Apple Wallet now, and it's amazing. I can have I don't know if you ever go to David Buster's, but the place where you play games. But now you
Yeah.
can get a David Buster's card on your phone, and you just hold it up to the machine, and you could just play. It's in the Apple Wallet. It's great. I always lose these cards, and there's just it's so easy. What's stopping there? Like I've bought Bitcoin before, even on Coinbase. What's stopping me from using it like I use Apple Pay? Just scan my phone and send Bitcoin to people. Like it's a little more complicated than that. What's the sort of what's preventing that?
Right. So your Apple Pay ultimately is running on the rails of the dollar. Okay. And those are kind of old rails, but they do work and they work everywhere. With the Bitcoin, right? Um, you know, we still have the double coincidence of wants problem in that I may have I may have some and want to buy something, but if you're the seller, like what are you going to do with the Bitcoin? Like you also have to want the Bitcoin and have to be able to give it to somebody else to get what you want. So it's really hard to get into that equilibrium. While the Apple Pay, since it relies on dollars, they know it's easy to get the dollars.
Is it just there's so I mean, what's preventing? I mean, Venmo right now, I could send you a dollar right in 5 seconds.
Exactly.
Bitcoin is
Yes.
a little more but why can't I mean? Why can't we like me and you? We both let's say I want to give you a Bitcoin and you want to spend it on other things. Well, what's stopping that? Why can't there be a Venmo for Bitcoin?
There could. There could. I mean, it is good. It is expensive because um, the the number of as you know, the number of transactions which Bitcoin can handle per second is relatively low, which means that Bitcoin is very good for if you want to send me $100,000, then no problem, let's do it through Bitcoin. If you want to send me $10, then it's going to cost us 15 or 25 to do that transaction. Um, well, and the bigger problem is that while I might want Bitcoin and maybe you have some to give, uh, that's a pretty rare, that's a pretty rare coincidence that you have some and I want it. That's pretty rare. Like even in George Mason, in the economics department, how many people really want Bitcoin? Not that many.
So this would be solved if say tomorrow everyone woke up and wanted Bitcoin, but it's still you say that there is a transaction cost. If I want to send you like a dollar, it uses
Yes.
energy or something. There's something that's preventing that.
Correct. Now, there are other cryptocurrencies where that is not the case. Like I'm an advisor to Elron, which uses e-gold, and we could send, thousands of dollars for pennies. So, but for Bitcoin, that is going to be the case, and that will always be the case for Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is going to be a better store of wealth. It's never going to be a medium of exchange, but other cryptocurrencies could definitely be mediums of exchange as well. But you have to build up a big enough base that you have two people, one of whom wants to give and one of whom wants to receive. And that's not easy.
Got it. So I am, this is, I want to ask you something while I've got an economist here. I don't know if you've ever written about this. Maybe you have at Marginal Revolution, but I can't recall off the top of my head. We're recording this on the afternoon of September 27th. Do you know anything about the European energy markets? Because apparently today there was a there was damage to Nord Stream 1, Nord Stream 2. The Russians accused like the Americans, and I don't know if the Americans have said it, but some people are saying it's the Russians. Do you have you been studying the European energy situation? Do you have any idea of how bad it's going to get and sort of, how it's going to, how these things are going to play out?
As of today, I'm very concerned about it. As you well know, they have been decommissioning nuclear plants, and they have walked right into, kind of a trap where they are dependent upon Russian oil, and now, yeah, the Russian oil either it was going to be stopped because Putin was going to turn the handle off, or now there's some sabotage. It's like I haven't been able to figure out like who would want to do this. Like, why would Putin want to blow up the line instead of just turning the tap off? I don't quite understand that. So it's unclear who would want to do this.
Well, the U.S.
But
has wanted to stop Nord Stream. I mean, the U.S. has tried to stop Nord Stream.
right,
It seems a pretty big step to take that without with against the wishes of the Europeans. That seems like pretty brazen. So
Yes, the U.S. is one somewhat. It seems a little bit implausible that the U.S. would blow it up, but you never know. Um, Certainly but yeah, the timing doesn't seem right to me. But I'm not an expert on these questions, but I do think if we have a bad winter, um, then it's going to be very tough. It's going to be very tough for Europe, and they're already facing inflation. Energy prices are higher than they've ever been, and all the potential for the unexpected. This blowing up of the line being just one example of that. But you think about what happened in Texas. With we had a terrible ice storm, right? And the Texas electrical grid basically went down, and it could have gone down even more than it did. And aging infrastructure, we haven't been building plants, we haven't been uh, uh, reconditioning and keeping up with transmission lines. So yeah, if Texas can go down, then Germany can go down. Even more likely. France is even not looking great. France has did not shut down the nuclear power plants, and yet they're still having trouble.
Mm. So there was a concern at the beginning of the war that that there would be starvation because of wheat. Apparently, markets adjusted because wheat is just one product and there are substitutes and
Right,
all that. Um, how much does that have lessons for energy? I mean, how what's the time scale and how easy is it and how affordable is it for Europe to go off?
right,
Because I think that's the goal, to go off Russian energy.
yeah.
Is that something that can be done
So I
within one or
think,
2 years,
yeah.
or not really?
So I think the wheat issue was a little bit of a red herring, in that it was true that Ukraine. We're supposed to say, you can't say the Ukraine anymore. I get in trouble. It was true that Ukraine was responsible for, even countries have pronouns, was responsible for a large share of the exports of wheat. But the most of the wheat is used internally. So the exports were actually a small share of total wheat production, right? So the decrease in the total amount of wheat was much smaller than the decrease in the export. So again, that was a little bit of a red herring. Um, Now, how quickly can Europe respond? So they have paused some of the nuclear plant shutdowns. First, they said, no, 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 that's totally impossible. But then when push came to shove, they were able to do some of that. The U.S. is exporting a lot of liquid natural gas, and I don't know. Again, this is beyond my knowledge, but we have been increasing our exports of LNG, and one, if I don't think Europe is going to starve. We could always, in a pinch, could increase that route. I don't know by how much, but it's going to be costly. It's just going to be costly. Unfortunately, Europe is rich. They can afford it, but it's not going to be cheap.
Yeah, and I've been surprised through this. I would have thought that serious economic damage. I would have thought they would have changed their foreign policy, but now I don't think that. I don't think there's any hint that that they're gonna stop supporting Ukraine in the war. So it's gonna be yeah, it's gonna be pretty interesting.
Yeah, the
I was
democracies have turned out to be tougher than I think a lot of us expected. Certainly more, they've been tougher than Putin expected. Putin was kind of, I think, going along the view that, oh, they're just namby-pamby, fat, blowhards, and they'll cave. And yeah, we haven't.
Yeah, that's true. Although I mean, we'll see. It's still, I mean, it's
Yeah.
still early. We have we
No,
haven't
it's
we
not
haven't
the
hit
end.
Yeah, we haven't hit winter yet. Italy
Yeah.
had just elected they're not, there's still supporters of Ukraine, the woman who's going to be the prime minister. But
Right.
some people in a coalition are a little bit, more, let's say, dovish on the Ukraine question. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's still a lot of
In
politics that
in
we'll see what
general,
happens.
on many, many things, my my view on what is possible has just expanded.
Mm.
Right, the variance of the world is much
Yeah,
higher
yeah,
than, like the 1990s, the great 1990s. Everything was like working out logically, sort of the way it should. Countries were becoming more market oriented, and China was getting richer, and India was getting rich. And then, since 2001, just the possible things which can happen. Trump being elected, like, just seemed like crazy, that could possibly happen, or, you know, uh, just
yeah. I think that too.
Crazy things that can happen,
Yeah, I think that
pandemics.
too, but at the same time, I've sort of yeah, that's true. Like COVID, and I would have never thought governments could, have lockdowns for the
Yeah,
the entire country. I would have never thought we would have stood for that. I knew much less
yeah.
what China does. Um,
Nuclear, it could be a nuclear weapon, could go off. The the
yeah,
the possibility of that, I think the experts are not like 10%, that's that's stunning. That's horrible. 10%.
that that is. At the same time, I do think there is a sort of I think in the last 10, 20 years, I do think that I've grown more sort of uh um optimistic about the sort of stability about the American led world order. So like 5, 10 years
Mm,
ago, it looked like China it might become a giant Hong Kong. It could just get growing at 5%, and with
right, right.
1.4 billion people, it's shooting itself in the foot, not just with COVID, which is the big thing, but also like she has like turned anti-capitalist and like starts to like attack people for making money, and this is not going to be good for them economically in the long run. Their birth
Yeah,
rates have they'll try to get that up, but they've also gone down from not it wasn't very high to start with. So China looks like less serious of a
yeah,
competitor. Russia
I
sort of
agree.
looked like maybe ideologically it could have some kind of people affinity. The people on the right could have some kind of affinity to it. I think that died with the invasion of Ukraine, and the West
Yeah,
is completely united against Russia. Muslim terrorism once seemed like it was a much bigger deal than it was 10, 15 years ago. That doesn't seem like much. They can control some ungoverned spaces at the corners of the world, but we don't wake up thinking about terrorism every day. So it does seem like sort of this idea that it's just going to be America leading and sort of Europe, and as its Robin to its Batman, and that's going to sort of run the world indefinitely. That looks
right,
more likely,
right.
sort of, than I would have thought, 5, 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that I think that, yeah, their country's shooting themselves in the foot. As I think there's something to that. Of course, the United States, although I agree with what you're saying, I think that's true. The U.S. has just lost so much social capital, that I think it's going to be hard to get that back. You know, our democracy just looks kind of a joke at times. Like when you have these, Vikings invading the Congress, like, we just look like a joke. Um, and pandemic policy was pretty bad, and we just so. But you're right, we're still you know in the land of the blind, the one-eyed person is king, and
Well,
maybe that's us.
the aesthetics of things like January 6th and Trump's election and thing, it's ugly, and if you care about national pride, you could say this is very embarrassing. But then you look at like sort of Trump, and like it's not like the GDP collapsed.
Yeah.
The crime rate went up. Doesn't look like it's Trump's fault. Looks like the other side, the other side's fault. The COVID thing.
But
A lot of
around the world, people are just people like from India, for example, they used to come to the United States and stay in the United States. Same with China, and now they're going back because the growth is there, the opportunities are there, and our democracy no longer looks like it no longer looks like you need to emulate us in order to be rich. So there's a lot of ways of getting rich. So I think just the space of possibilities has just gotten much bigger. Liberal democracy looked like end of history looked like the only way to go, but now I think the space of possibilities has um, just expanded. Though I think you're right. China is not the threat
Yeah,
that people
yeah,
thought.
but exactly right. So India is a capitalist, democracy.
Yeah,
China was, I mean, the China model was the potentially the alternative.
yeah,
Now, I just saw a headline: they're going to grow slower than the rest of Asia for the first time in 30 years since Deng Xiaoping's reforms, or slightly after that. And so it's just like that doesn't seem like China was the only real contender as something, but you could have this technocratic government that does standardized tests and doesn't worry about democracy. And
right,
China was never a very charismatic country where people I think admired that, okay, they have a lot of growth and it sort of works. But with them masking forever, and being afraid of COVID, and destroying their own economic growth for that, and closing up
yeah,
to the world, it seems like the U.S. the liberal democracy is going to win by default. I mean, there's
yeah,
really nobody else showing up.
true.
Yeah. So yeah, this was fun, Alex. I mean, people could follow you on Marginal Revolution. They could follow you on Twitter. Anywhere else you would like people to sort of keep up with your work?
Yeah, you'll find most of it on Twitter. Marginal Revolution is where you should go. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, Alex, I appreciate it, and yeah, great talking to you.
Great. Good talking to you.